Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks. Sorry, just getting ourselves going in the usual way. Thanks for joining us today. This is one of the series of the CIBSE Healthcare webinars, and it's about the new era in fire safety. I'm Mike Ralph. I was previously the principal engineer for NHSE. I've now moved north of the border to Scotland, where I've got less on fire, but more on everything else. But we'd sort of planned that before that. And with me today is Mazin Daoud, who's the National Fire Safety Lead for NHSE, and the prime driver behind all the changes of fire code, which is what we're going to talk to you about today. So it's there's lots to take in, and whereas we're looking at the audience as being mainly here for the sort of the building design and implications of that, but there's also some organisational, operational changes that are happening nationally and that will impact upon the health service. So we're gonna touch upon that and how the programme for fire code will work in towards that. And you know what the outcomes will be, because it's you know, Grenfell's changed the horizons continually, or is changing the horizons continually in fire safety and how we're going forward. And so, you know, we're today to take you into that new era, what we've done so far and what the plans for the future are as to how we're going to sort of match up to that. So without further ado, I'll let Mazin introduce himself and kick off, and I'll speak to you shortly. The Q&A facility is enabled, so if you put your questions and answers in it, we have got time at the end, which we will try and answer as many as possible, but we will take all your questions, and all your questions will get an answer, whether it be sort of you know, written if it's not able to give it on the day. So without further ado, over to you, Maz.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me okay, Mike? Because if you, yeah, great. Yeah, I'm Maz Daoud. I work for NHS England and have done so for 2.5 years. And I'm been given a new title now, apparently, which I'm supposed to start using, which is Head of Fire Safety. As I'm the only one in NHS England doing fire safety, I suppose it follows. Anyway, so if we can move on to the next slide, I'll start. Brilliant. Grenfell. So Grenfell is one of those moments that will probably be etched in the memory of all of the people that witnessed it. Although strangely enough, I was speaking to a young man last week and mentioned Grenfell, and he said, "What was that?" So like many things, it's sort of fading into history, although relatively recent history at the moment. So we know about Grenfell and we know what happened. And after Grenfell, the government commissioned the independent review of building regulations, and it was led by Dame Judith Hackett. And the final report that she produced, or the review produced, was in May 2018, and it had a lot of recommendations in there, 53, and some of those have subsequently been enacted into law. Now, the main emphasis on the independent review was concerning high-risk residential buildings. So just about everything they came out with was regarding high-risk residential buildings, although they did make recommendations that went beyond their initial that scope as well. So if we can move on to the next slide. So what's happened since? Well, very recently, as in last month, for instance, hospitals and care homes as well were designated as high-risk buildings, so long as they met the height criteria, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there are 4 stages, 4 gateways. Gateway 1 is planning, which it looks as if hospitals and care homes are not obliged to meet. Gateway 2 is building control, so the initial building control. Gateway 3 is when the works are completed, that final certificate, and then Gateway 4 is the occupation phase. So hospitals and care homes aren't required to meet the occupation stage or the planning stage, but they are obliged to meet Gateways 2 and Gateway 3, so long as they meet the height criteria. And if we can move on to the next slide. Measuring height. Now, Mike and I were both part of the National Fire Chiefs Council high risk residential Buildings Committee, which was in force for several years prior to the most recent legislation coming into force. And the National Fire Chiefs Council pressed for it not just being anything over 6 stories, so at least 7 stories, but also the 18 metres height. So to meet the height criteria, a building must be at least 18 metres in height or at least 7 stories. Now, blocks of flats tend to have stories of around about 3 metres high, whereas in hospitals they tend to be closer to 4 metres. I think the average is about 3.8 metres. So you can see that the number of stories in a hospital are far less than in a block of flats to meet the height criteria. It does exclude rooftop plant rooms, but for instance, a hospital that I'm dealing with is putting in place a rooftop garden, which then will count because it's going to be occupied as well. So if we can move on to the next slide, Mike. And this is a very interesting one because hospital buildings tend to be quite large, at least compared with blocks of flats, and cover larger areas. So where you've got a sloping site, and for instance, I was at Kingston upon Thames Hospital a few weeks ago, and one of the buildings, well, it's built on Kingston Hill, which is sloping, and one of the buildings is not a particularly tall building. It only has 4 stories used for patients. It also has a plant room, which is on the 2nd floor. But because it's on a sloping site, if you measure the height as shown in the diagrams here, from the lowest point externally to the floor level of the highest floor, excluding any plant rooms, it came within the height criteria of 18 metres. So it's going to be fairly close with a lot of hospitals. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. And this is the one which I think is the most interesting. So if a building which meets the height criteria is linked to others which may not meet the height criteria, they are all counted as the one building. This is pretty typical in a hospital where you've got a corridor or a series of corridors interlinking one building to another. So looking at Kingston where I was, the one building met the height criteria, but then there were corridors to lots of other buildings as well on site. So in theory, and there is guidance out there which you can easily look up, but the guidance is reasonably specific, is that if it shares a doorway or a corridor with another building, then it forms part of the same building. So if we extend that a little bit further, the height criteria then would be from the lowest point of the lowest of those buildings to the highest point of the highest of those buildings, which then you might think, well, okay, a building which perhaps is no more than 2 or 3 stories high might, because it's on a sloping site, still meet the height criteria. So it's one to really watch out for. And I've asked for legal clarification of this from our lawyers, who seem to think, yep, that's the way it is. But I'm in the process of asking for clarification from the building safety regulator and see what their view is and see if it aligns with what the lawyers have told us. So even find that the buildings that are only 2 or 3 stories could come within scope. We can move on to the next slide. So what do gateways 2 and 3 cover? Well, if you're planning to build a new high-risk building, if you're creating one through a change of use or alterations or extensions, or plan to undertake building work to an existing high-risk building, these all come within gateways 2 and 3. And there is a definition of building work, and there are a few exemptions, and the few exemptions are around where you need to do building work urgently, or you've got competent person schemes. But other than that, just about everything else is going to have to go through the building safety regulator. We can move on to the next slide. So what does this mean to you? This means that you need to submit a building control approval application to the building safety regulator to obtain approval before you can start any building work. It looks as if this process is going to take several weeks, and I know I've been involved with some projects which are you're coming towards the second half or in the second half of the financial year, and you've got some money to spend, and it, you know, you're told, well, can you spend this within the financial year? And the answer is usually yes, we can. But once you factor in things like the additional time that it's going to be taken to submit your plans to the building safety regulator for their approval, and for them to give you approval before you can start work, this could actually add a considerable period of time and maybe not enable you to meet that criteria of getting it done within the financial year. And if we can move on to the next slide.
Thank you, Maz. That's one for me, I think. As Maz said, that so we're getting the view that legislation is impinging upon, you know, what we're doing before we've even started doing the specialities of all the things that we might find in healthcare. Well, that's pretty much so when we were looking at the review of the HGMs, which I'll come on to in a minute. But something to be like keenly aware of is that the Home Office, you know, are currently revising their suite of their Article 50 or Green Book guidance, which is their advice to fire safety inspection officers upon the applications of the regulatory reform order and sort of what to look for. Probably the most complicated one of those is the healthcare guide. So, you know, we're sitting there looking at what we're doing, how we're going to do it, and, you know, how's that going to tie in with the HGM? Because ideally, if we're doing you know, a competency and knowledge and skills framework, which I'll also come on to later, we all need to be singing from the same hymn book, and what the standards that the health service is working to and trying to attain need to be the same standards that the fire safety inspection officers from the FRSs are going to come and look at and review through. What Maz sort of hasn't covered is that he's done an incredible amount of work getting a memorandum of understanding, as in a National Fire Concordat, between NHS England and the National Fire Chiefs Council, which represent the fire and rescue services and fire and rescue authorities throughout England. And this is so that we can tie in that we're all looking at the same things. There's open and mutual conversation and a duty of candour. And that we're all looking at the same rules. So it's very keen that the Article 50 revision is very much in line with what we're saying for our fire risk assessment criteria and how we're sort of going to take these things forward. So if I'd have the next slide, please. So this leads into sort of like, you know, what we were doing with fire code, and, you know, so it's fire code's the 05 suite of documents. There's 3 currently, and they're sort of covering sort of all the sort of topics that you're going to look at in design, operation, and fire safety management. A little bit of history. There was a scoping exercise which has taken place, and all the documents were reviewed, because some has been updated and some hasn't, and it's, you know, there's anomalies between what it says in sort of some of the sections in 501 and in with legislation that's changed, and also within other areas that have been reviewed within fire code, so that it was to look at it in its entirety, and so what we needed to do to sort of get a coherent set of documents, and some was less relevant would be reviewed and perhaps reviewed, and other sort of services sort of taking it forward needed to be sort of prioritised, and we're looking for a sort of completion of that in 2023-24, but I think that's probably slips a little bit, but I'll let Maz cover that when he gets onto the more detail. So next slide, please. Right, so going back to sort of what's come out of the scoping exercise, now we've got to where we are. I mean, I think there's probably a 0 missing off that. There were thousands of comments received, and there's so many things which feed into fire safety management, and it's one of those cross-cutting themes that goes across, whether it's sort of ventilation, medical gases, fire across it, electrical fire crosses all of these things, so all the comments were taken in considerations, and it was very clear that fire code needed to be done as an entirety, but it's a bit like eating an elephant. You've got to do it sort of one bite at a time. So we picked out the sort of key areas which need the most attention to meet with current legislation and the move forwards in improving fire safety for everybody, that's being driven by the government's agenda. So I mean, key bits of that was really sort of part A, Part B, which is on sort of AFDs and firearm systems, and Part K, which was for the fire risk assessments. But Maz will go into more detail on that in a minute. I think the other thing that came out of it was the much greater emphasis on sort of mental health and the facilities that. I mean, it is really. It's not if you have a fire in a mental health establishment, it's when, due to the different sort of causal factors that are there. It's a different mindset and a different way of sort of looking at it. And within the new documentation, we much more wanted to sort of cover, how that would come in and how that would sort of go across. So on to the next slide, please. And this is back to Maz. We'll take you through the details of some of the areas we looked at. Thanks, Maz.
Hi, thanks, Mike. Okay, so we looked at the scoping exercises suggested that we needed to revise 3 documents. One, all of them were in the 0503 series. One, Part A, which was initially general fire provisions and covered a whole host of different subjects, but there was coming back to us the insistence that training was really critical in a hospital and training should have its own document. So what we've done is we've made Part A, which did cover training to some extent, solely on training. Training is also covered in 0501, which is on management, but 0501 will be reviewed at some time, hopefully in the near future, with a view to either taking all of the training out of there or maybe including what's currently in Part A, or the Part A that we've just done, into 0501 as a whole document within it. So Part A just now covers training, and it gives training its own document, so it highlights the importance of training, which is one of the most important things in a healthcare environment. It's more important than just one of the most, I think it's the most important thing in a healthcare environment. If the staff can behave and act in an appropriate manner, looking out for unsafe practices, unsafe items, then the whole building is so much safer. So it's critical. It's tied into legislative requirements. Yes, training is a legal requirement, although the fire safety order isn't very specific on frequency of training or anything like that. And we've also included in Part A an evacuation drill. So we want a real life drill wherever that's feasible, but we are appreciating that in many instances this isn't feasible for a number of factors, and Mike mentioned mental health units. Certainly in mental health units it may or it may not be feasible, but where it's not feasible, then it's not just a case of, okay, we can't do an evacuation drill because of whatever. It's a case of, well, what can we do to reach the same level of competence and assurance that our staff know exactly what to do in an emergency situation. And the legislation is quite interesting because it doesn't say that you must do an evacuation drill. It actually says where necessary. So we're saying where it's necessary, and we're also saying these are the places that it's necessary and the times that it's necessary. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Mike. Right, I wasn't sure if there was any more on Part A, but I'll just mention the critical aspect in Part A on training is the training needs assessment. That's absolutely important, and a lot of emphasis is placed on that, much more so than currently is. Part B is perhaps the most controversial of the documents that we're revising. Part B is on fire alarms, and we're also going to include false alarms as well. So what's the difference between Part B? Well, what's the difference between Part B, between fire alarm systems in a hospital and fire alarm systems, let's say, in an office block or a factory? The main thing is the extent of it and the cause and effect. So in a hospital, if a fire alarm goes off in one area, whether that's because of a detector going off or a call point being activated, you'll get a continuous tone in that area wherever you've got progressive horizontal evacuation. In adjacent zones, you'll get an intermittent tone going off, and other zones further out from that, you won't get anything. You'll get all sorts of stuff happening as well. Your ventilation may or may not shut down, your lifts may ground, doors will unlock, hold open devices on other doors will activate. Whereas and that's very specific on local detection in local areas. Whereas in an office building, all of those things will happen probably on any detector going off in any location. So that's a big difference in the fire alarm systems. So the new part B is going to include a section on maintenance. The existing one doesn't. It just relies on the British standard for maintenance. So how's that going to be different? Well, because of the extensive cause and effect, and the fact that the cause and effect is critical to get things right, and very critical in a healthcare environment in a large hospital. And the amount of cause and effect lines, if you look at a cause and effect matrix in a hospital, it might run into thousands of lines, whereas in an office building or something like that, it'll only run into, maybe a few dozen, maybe 100 or so lines. So the extent of it is much greater. So we think that the cause and effect and the testing of the cause and effect is more important, or having confidence in the cause and effect is more important than many of the other factors which are monitored anyway, or may be monitored anyway by the fire alarm systems. So we know that smoke detectors are monitored constantly by a modern fire alarm system, and if there are any issues with them, it will be brought up on the panel. Smoking detectors, which is currently supposed to be done annually, so that is putting smoke into smoke detectors to make sure they're working correctly, isn't particularly easy to do in a hospital where you've got patients, and remember, over COVID, access to hospitals was really difficult. Smoking wasn't done in that period, and we didn't notice any difference in the reliability of fire alarm systems following that. So what we've said is, where you've got a self-monitoring system and subject to you doing a risk assessment on it, you can omit some or all of that requirement to smoke detectors on an annual basis. We're also including testing of cool points on an annual basis as well. That's brought within this scope, so they're fairly large. What we have included, though, which currently is done on I think it's done 6 monthly, is check that nothing's changed within the hospital and this system is appropriate, that the call points are accessible, that the smoke detectors aren't covered. We're including that in the monthly check, which is done by local staff, often to be fire wardens, or we've actually said other estate staff or any other staff that are trained to do it. And the training is fairly basic, and we've got a list of things that they need to be checking as well. We don't anticipate the amount of testing that currently is being done will be reduced at all. What we do anticipate is that the emphasis will be changed from that going around and smoking detectors on an annual basis to actually ensuring that the cause and effect is operating as it should be. And we are finding that following fires that have occurred, it's not unusual for the cause and effect to not work as it should do. The other thing we're introducing is false alarms and unwanted fire signals. So false alarms is any time that the fire alarm activates and it isn't caused by a fire. And unwanted fire signals are the times when that false alarm, so the fire alarm goes off and then the fire brigade is summoned. So that's the difference between them. We're introducing a seek and search protocol, which at the moment, it's not, the current part B does not permit seek and search in a patient care area, but we are going to permit that. So seek and search can be carried out subject to certain provisions in a patient care area, and we're also including call points in that as well. So activation of the call point will, or may I should say, initiate a seek and search rather than automatic call to the fire and rescue service. The other thing we're doing at the moment is that currently there's a number of, within the British standard, there's an acceptable level of false alarms, which then can be translated, if you're going to call the fire brigade automatically, into an acceptable level of unwanted fire signals where the fire brigade is called. We're actually saying that there is no acceptable level of unwanted fire signals. So it's inevitable that there are going to be occasions when the fire and rescue service are called because the fire alarm is activated. But we're not saying that, yes, you can have 10 or 20 or 30 or however many of these before you actually need to start investigating and be concerned about this. We're saying that you need to be concerned about this and investigate every single unwanted fire signal and try and reduce the incidence of them. The other thing, as Mike said, we have introduced further advice on mental health. We were torn between whether or not mental health needed its own HTM on fire, but decided ultimately that it was probably better to include mental health in the new suite as it's coming out. So there's further advice on mental health in Part B. And if we can move on to the next slide. Part K. So Part K is fire risk assessments. It's a fairly oldish document, the existing Part K. The new Part K is very much on the basis of the PAS. So PAS 79. PAS 79, I think, as I recall, has a 3x3 matrix of likelihood and consequences, whereas the Part K is going to retain the 5x5 that's in the current Part K, simply because it ties in with other health and safety reporting systems in the NHS. If it wasn't for that, we'd have gone solely to the PAS 79 system. It says it's aligned to Article 50 guidance. Well, the Article 50 guidance, as Mike said, is being reviewed by the Home Office. It's been drawn up in two parts. So there's a common part, which is common to all types of premises, and then there's a specific part, which is specific to different types of premises. And the part that's specific to healthcare is going to be relatively short, I'm led to believe. And we are trying to tie in as much as possible with the existing and also the proposed Article 50 guidance. We haven't seen the healthcare guidance yet, the new one, but we have seen the first draft of the initial introduction, which is fairly long at the moment. That's the first draft, so I'm sure it's going to change quite extensively. So what else have we brought into the PAS? Well, unsurprisingly, we've introduced an external review that's aligned to PAS 9980. PAS 9980 does say that it doesn't cover healthcare or hospitals. Having said that, there is no other document that does. So in the absence of that, we're actually saying, yes, despite that, we think that there should be an external review in line with PAS 9980, which is very much risk-based. It also introduces a primary whole building fire risk assessment and a secondary one, which is for specific wards, departments or areas. This is quite important because currently the risk assessments are broken down into lots of little units, and you might go into a ward and do the fire risk assessment for that ward, but not really have much information on how that ward or that department interacts within the building, how for instance, the compartmentation within, or the state of the compartmentation, the maintenance of the compartmentation, the fire dampers, the fire alarm system, and all of these aspects interact with your local fire risk assessment. So there's going to be an overall fire risk assessment and then a secondary fire risk assessment. They are going to cover slightly different things, as you can imagine, and it's important that all areas that need a fire risk assessment are covered and no areas are excluded. So every bit is going to be included in this. And at the bottom there it says additional guidance on competence. Well, Mike's going to talk on this in a little bit at the moment, and I think there's a bit more coming up on it anyway on some of the other slides. So if we can move on to the next slide. Is this right? Water suppression systems. We had a literature review on water suppression systems. At the moment, England does not have any guidance on water suppression systems, sprinklers, water mist, specifically for healthcare. Wales, interestingly enough, does, and we were approached by London Fire Brigade Fire Engineering Section, who said, really, we need something for healthcare premises, to include water mist systems, because we are getting more and more water mist systems, or where people are seeking approval for more and more water mist systems. So the literature review will lead at some time to an HTM on water suppression systems. I'm not sure exactly when, but hopefully sooner rather than later. The main emphasis is that, well, the benefits of water suppression are plain to just about everyone to see. So where I think the guidance on when a water suppression system should be included in a new build will be tightened up, and it might be brought in line with residential accommodation. We need more work on water mist, so we need more information, and we need to go into that in a bit more detail. There are some fairly major hospitals in England which are starting to fit water mist systems, so we're looking closely at what they do, how they do it, and how effective that is in order to produce the guidance. Sprinklers are likely to remain the go-to for a new build for a number of factors. The main one is the interchangeability of the various parts of a sprinkler system, whereas water mist systems are very manufacturer specific, and also the fact that they've been around for a considerable period of time, and we have a lot of knowledge on sprinkler systems. So, and also because it would generally work out less expensive to fit a sprinkler system, certainly in a new build, than a water mist system. So that's why sprinklers are likely to remain the go-to for new build. I did go and look at a hospital in Wales, the Grange in South Wales, which was opened a couple of years ago now, which is sprinkler protected throughout, and it seems to be very effective there. Water mist standards and issues will be considered primarily for existing buildings. So it seems that where you've got an existing building, and for whatever matter the standards are not suitable and sufficient, then water mist system might be a go-to to reduce the risk, to compensate for other matters. And that certainly seems to be the place, the viewpoint on several systems that we've looked at. So is the purpose to tell us anything new? Mike, in fact, read the literature review, and he said, well, it hasn't really told us anything new, but it has told us what we already knew. And that's very true, which is quite reassuring, really, because what we thought, it has been emphasised by what the literature review has actually told us. So I think we're quite comfortable with moving forwards with a document on water suppression systems that will also include water mist systems. Thank you. If we can move on to the next slide. Technical review. Well, Mike said on the previous slide, it said there are hundreds of comments. Well, we've had actually about 1,500 comments. Every single one of them has been considered. We've gone through them. Some of them we've actually discussed for hours. Some of them a lot less. We're almost finished. We are on the last 3 pages of the last document. So I think that will finish next week. So of the 3 documents, it looks like Part B will be the first one that will be issued. We have a group called the National Fire Policy Advisory Group, and the final version will go to them first to consider before it's published. It will then go to our comms department as well. So it looks like Part B on fire alarm systems will be the first one. Part A on training will be the second, and then Part K on fire risk assessments will be the last. We're looking at these documents being published sometime early, certainly Part B early next year, Part A springtime, early spring, and Part K by late spring. So we're not looking at too long now before these documents are out there. And if you can move on to the next slide. Oh, I think Mike's going to talk about this.
Oh, he is when he unmutes himself, Maz. That's a schoolboy error from me there. Yeah, thank you, Maz. That's very interesting. I mean, fire risk accreditation. How how often have we sort of heard about that and discussed about that? I mean, I've literally just finished going through the process, and we're launching it on the 5th of December in Scotland for a national credentialing system for medical gas pipe systems. Which, but more of that as I sort of go into it. But I guess that it. Going back to what Maz was saying about sort of Part K, I was on the part of the regional steering group for PAS 79, and when we went through it, there's having the sort of guidelines and having the guidance, and the form and how you record it is relatively simple, and the assessment, it falls out of that, but it's the knowledge, skills, and behaviours behind assessing what your answers to your questions are, which was the key piece, and that competency thing is often overlooked, and certainly with how the old Part K had been sort of done, you could go through it not knowing what you don't know and come out with an answer which would seem acceptable, but it wasn't, because it wasn't a true reflection of the risks and hazards that you'd reviewed. So given that sort of this sort of replicated itself in lots of different areas and was picked up on some of the Article sort of 50 guidance, it was felt that we really needed a rigorous sort of scheme with knowledge, skills, and behaviours that would back and support that. So next slide, please. So we followed a business case procedure to sort of go through and work out exactly what we want and what we want to achieve and how we're going to do it. So likewise, this followed the format that we'd taken for the medical gas designated people within HTMO 201, and it's about the specifications for the job descriptions and the person requirements that would come out of a training needs analysis, and what the areas they would fall into, and then that we would get a national occupational standard that we could verify the learning outcomes and have that as an accepted standard of competency for the knowledge, skills, and behaviours we want to see exhibited. And this, you then goes back to my new triangle of fire, that you've got the Article 50 as to what you need to do. You've got your framework that would come out of this to prove competency, because it's a credential register, and then you would have the communications conduit through the Fire Concordat, so that you would close these. So I mean, there was some talk at one point in time that you'd virtually have almost self-reporting once you'd got an agreed Article 50 guidance that was in line with what the requirement was from the HTMs for suitable and sufficiency of buildings. You would have competent people, and they would be credentialed, and they would have to do CPD to maintain that. And then if there was anything that fell outside that level, that it would be communicated almost like self-reporting to the fire and rescue services, so that you would have a closed loop for issues. So next slide, please. Ooh, are we there? Right. So I sort of touched there on sort of credentialing, and obviously the roles that we're looking at, they're still being finalised and graded. This work's sort of taken. It's had some sort of delays onto it with the changing national requirements. We're looking at sort of it'll be a requirement for a fire risk assessor, for the actual overall fire safety manager, fire safety advisor, and fire safety trainers. And within some of those, there may be subdivisions within that for specific areas and for specific skills that would be needed. But I mean, it will come out with, I mean, those of you that aren't familiar with national occupational standards, effectively it's a very detailed description of the knowledge, skills, and behaviours that you need to be able to show and demonstrate, whether it be through portfolio, direct examination, observed observation of practice, or documentary review. And so once those standards have been sort of set and agreed, they would form a national template framework, which you would to be a class of designated person for one of those roles, that you would have to meet those educational and knowledge and skill requirements. That to overview this, we're looking to use a platform which is already available and used throughout the NHS for other things, which is through Intellicentrics, which is an information portal where you can a link and sign in. So next slide, please. Yeah, sorry, that's I've talked past myself, which is I thought. So this is how you're going through the National Qualifications Framework, and this is how they would be assessed for the various grades. We're still looking at a senior grade for the impartial observer, the fire AE. There's very many various sort of accreditation schemes through professional engineering institutions that sort of cover that, and it's still as to whether we're going to use that and just agree specific learning outcomes that would need to be seen within that scope of registration for doing those specific titles. Because I think healthcare, it covers a lot of things which you're just not going to meet anywhere else, so that it may be a special requirement, but we that will then be incorporated into this scheme. We're sort of, when we get to it. Next slide, please. Right, so this is sort of taking us through what we would do and how it's a three-part quality assured process to make sure that the checkers are checked and that we're getting an open and transparent and equitable level of quality through it. So we'd have the National Occupational Standards, which are currently being constructed and written, and sort of Maz is a key contributor to that, and we've got the Fire College is also assisting us with it. It'll be a credit rated qualification, which is issued by the awarding body, who assess the skill level for the various competencies that would need to be displayed. Then looking at sort of how that would set up and what the criteria would be for the professional registration and credentialing platform. And that once that standard is set, it's then externally validated on sort of for competencies and observed practice, and for educational levels, as in if there would be degree or master's levels would be on there. So this then gives you a very tight agreement of what competency is and how you can sort of define it, which a lot of you that have listened to some of the Grenfell inquiry, that defining competency, it's you can say it in a few words, but to actually mean something, it's a Bible. So next slide, please. Right, so as again, I was saying that's going to be sort of a huge sort of quantification of how that's going to sort of be put together, and how that refers to the document standards for what we're looking at. A lot of the units will be common and work their way up, as in, like, if you're a fire safety advisor, that's a large technical part which would then be part of the units, which would also be within a fire safety manager. So where they sort of cross over, these units would be the same, and you would just add them up within the portfolio. As legislation changes, and as that sort of the control and closing the loop, which we're seeing through the building safety regulator, that will all sort of lead into it. A lot of the issues of the management of fire and firefighting, and the changes to how sort of FRAs and fire rescue services are going to provide that will always feed into this. So it's a very iterative process of how we go forward. But we're hoping with, I mean, Maz has had a lot of meetings with the Home Office, and they're looking at some form of national competency register. I think by the time that is announced, I think healthcare will be ahead of the field on what we're leaning and on what we're setting up. I mean, it's not going to be a change tomorrow. I think we're probably looking at a 3 to 5 year lead in from when this starts, and that's probably 6 months to a year away. So it's the start of a journey, but it's the start of an important journey where we'll have the knowledge, skills, and behaviours that need to be demonstrated and appreciated, so that we don't have another Grenfell. Next slide, please. Oh, that's advantageous. That's to lessons learned. So over to you, Maz.
Hi, yes. So the whole of the Grenfell inquiry was around about learning lessons from an incident which had happened. And at the moment in the NHS, we don't have a system where we can learn lessons from incidents which might be fires, or they might be near misses. So what we are hoping to introduce in the near future, and Alessandra Gambi, who's on this call, has done a lot of the work in preparing a simple to fill in form which captures all of the information and can be done on a mobile phone in about 6 minutes, so it's not going to take too long. But the idea is to advise incidents or near misses which have occurred, so that it says steps to prevent similar events occurring can be taken. As an example, we have had in the last couple of years, I think 3 incidents involving batteries, each of which has resulted in quite serious fires. 2 of them were lithium-ion batteries, and the third one was a lead-acid battery. So as a result of that, we actually introduced a technical note on batteries in healthcare, which set out certain issues that need to be addressed locally by each trust. So we are learning from incidents, but we don't have an effective way of capturing all of these incidents. So once this is out there for use, and there is a sort of simplified version of this which is currently on the NAFO, that's the National Association of Healthcare Fire Officers website. And in fact, I saw the first completed form that had been sent in. So that was a form as opposed to the form that's on your mobile that Alessandra's been working on, or on your laptop. And interestingly enough, that was a near miss. Well, actually, at what point? I think it was a near miss, and that involved a battery as well. It was a lead acid battery. So what's the idea of it? It's so that we can learn, so that we can do things before they become a real issue, or prevent things from happening in the future. So it's to identify hazards and trends. And it also enables identification of equipment or operational failures or shortcomings. So again, we have had incidents where particular types of, let's say, air conditioning units have short-circuited or caught fire. We've had incidents where particular types of fans have done the same. We've had incidents where particular battery systems associated with computers on wheels have also caught fire. So we need to know about these. We need to know the implications of them, and then once we've done that, we can actually issue guidance on it, issue warnings or whatever. And the fourth point here is perhaps the most important, as well as all the negative things that are associated with this. Well, what's gone really well? How has it worked well? The one that I just mentioned on the NAFO website, well, actually, security were aware of this at a really early stage and acted in an appropriate manner and extinguished the fire before it spread. So then that tells us, okay, so security are important, and it's important that they're trained to deal with these situations, and it's important that they are able to extinguish fires using locally supplied fire extinguishers. So we can identify positive outcomes, and we can incorporate these in our HTM. So our HTM on training is including a section on fire extinguishers and fire extinguisher training as well. So that's where we are with the lessons learned. It hasn't been rolled out. The form hasn't gone live yet within the NHS. I'm not sure if it's going to go live as is, or whether we're going to trial it for a period first, but it's something to look out for. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Anonymity. So this is an interesting one, because do we have these anonymous, or don't we have them anonymous? And we're still not 100% sure. It says, due to potential legal and other issues, all information will be anonymised. We did take some legal advice on this to see if we could say, well, any information that you provide here won't be used against you, so to speak. But then we were told that wouldn't work, because if a legal investigation took place, they could ask for any information that we had, regardless of what we said on the form. So it would be made available. So we're not 100% sure whether we're going to go to anonymising these or not. The way it looks at the moment, perhaps we won't, because it would be really useful if we had that information to be able to go back to the people and get further information. But this is very much in the spirit of collaboration. We're not there to beat you over the head because things have gone wrong. We are there to find out what went wrong, what went right, how things can be improved, and what information can be promulgated to other people so that the good things are emulated and the bad things are avoided. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. And so what's on there? What's on the lessons learned? This is just an example. So nature of the incident, what happened, how did it start, how did it develop? So this is, you know, a fire occurred within an adolescent room of a ward. A little bit of detail about the ward, and then it was about, well, what happened? A child's toy had been brought into the trust and placed on charge. On further investigation on Amazon, the said toy has a history of overheating and on 3 known occasions caught fire that were unbeknown to either trust staff or the parents. The fire developed and spread to other combustibles within the room that were around the origin of the fire, causing the fire to develop. So this is the sort of thing we want in our lessons learned. What happens, some background of what caused it and how it spread. If we can move on to the next slide. Okay, technical guidance. So what are we doing? So this is the technical guidance that we are putting out, and as I said, we have now done this. We put out the technical guidance on batteries, and basically it requires everyone to review their policy on batteries, on lithium-ion batteries and the charging of batteries, the location of it, and it's part of a much wider piece of work now, because, well, subsequent to us doing that, there was the infamous airport car park fire, which may or may not have been spread by the presence of battery vehicles. We don't know. I don't know at the moment. I think that's going to come out soon. So what you know, this is the way it's going to flow, and we are going to be issuing technical guidance as a part of this. Another example that led to the issue of the guidance was a 3-story contractor's cabin, and the top floor of it was pretty much burnt out, and it was due again. The most likely cause was charging lithium-ion batteries for contractors' tools or their associated charging equipment. So if we can move on to the next one, please.
That's the last slide.
Oh, is that the last one?
That's the end of the show,
Well,
Maz. We're on,
I'll
we're
hand
on to
back
the
over to
questions
Mike
now. And that's I think I must have put the wrong one on there, because that rather threw you. That should have said technical guidance for the because it's then from the lessons learned we then issue technical guidance, and that was what that was. And then there was another slide that says questions, but that's I seem to have, I'll take that on the chin, I seem to have put the wrong version on there. So we've got one question at the minute, so unless it's been super obvious and we've explained it so well, or people are dumbfounded by what we've said, I don't know, but please send any questions in that you've got. We've got a question that says, does this guidance cover apply to the devolved nations as well as England? Well, I can quite easily answer that one, and it's yes, it sort of does, but we have to sort of kilt them and leak them, if I can say that and still be politically correct, because obviously there's variations in sort of Wales as to what they do, and that sprinklers are mandated for healthcare, and likewise in Scotland the building regulations are slightly different. So we have other ways that it's looked, and that the again, we don't have the CQC in Scotland, so that the enforcement route again is also slightly different. So the technical principles and applications of it will, but there are some vagaries around the sort of, the regulatory reform order and some of the other the application of building regulations. So that's that one. So any other questions? The people's fingers not working that sort of quickly. But, oh. Well, there's Alice has got his hand up, but I don't think we can unmute him to say anything, or is he trying to tell us that he can't put anything in there? Is that sorry, Alistair, and I think because of the way the meeting's been set up, we can't unmute you. Right, I think there's something.
I think Laura could unmute him.
I don't think Laura's on the call.
All right. Okay.
Because I've just tried and I can't. I think it's a blanket organizer thing. And I also wonder if anybody else's questions are coming in there, because I noticed that the only question is actually coming from a member of the panel. Right, answers on a postcard. But if anybody has any questions of interest, if they send them to me at my,
Sorry, I could. Is it Alistair Burley?
yeah,
I'll try and make him a presenter. That might work. I'll just see what
No,
happens.
don't do that. You've very
he's
successfully
speaking.
unmuted me.
yeah, all right.
Okay.
As soon as we all know who you are, Alistair, we'll take it that you.
Well, good afternoon to you both. Thanks for that. It's been really, really informative. Mike, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the fire risk assessment process,
Yeah.
and you talked about cross-referencing to national occupational standards and so on. Is there any proposal to make use of the current IFSM and IFA and BAFE SP205 type schemes that are currently prevalent, or would it be an autonomous scheme that you're suggesting?
Right. Well, actually, this is where it gets tied into and sort of. I mean, they're all fully written and done and sorted in Scotland, and the person that did those, I won't mention his name, is now working with NHSE and Mazin and the team on preparing the same thing. The issue is it's trying to get something that everybody can agree on. And there's lots of standards which are current, and you cross pieces and bits of them, but trying to sort of get something that regulates them out has been proven very, very difficult. Now, what we're proposing is that these national occupational standards, you will be able to meet them because you can take like a portfolio approach to it, and for the various aspects of it, and you will have what do they call it, compliance levels from various other existing schemes. So you might be able to sort of go in and say, well, I've got that, and you can put your portfolio together. And because you've got things within other areas, that will qualify. But trying to get everybody in the like Eduqual and SQA and everybody to talk together, so to recognise schemes, has proved difficult. So we're not saying that you're going to have to take everything absolutely utterly again, but it is going to be the National Occupational Standard, the learning outcomes, and the KSB framework that's behind that. There's not, if you've already qualified, if you've already got these schemes, it's going to be relatively easy just to put in the portfolio of what you've got and for that to be accepted. And that's why when it's come to the authorising engineer fire, that's a difficult one, because there's, they're all professional engineering institutions, they're all done under the EC UK, so in theory they're the same, and it's just trying to get some sort of agreement, which is proving a lot harder than you would have thought to sort of get that. Does that answer you? Go on.
It does, yeah. So you're going to be treated with regard to the FRA process. Then it would be, and going back to the National Occupational Standards, I believe the terminology is evidence of prior learning and accreditation, isn't it?
That's it. Yeah.
It will be portable as such that you could transpose it across.
Yeah.
But the reason I ask it, there's a number of trusts that, as you know, when we do audits, and we tend to recommend that where the fire safety advisors are undertaking in-house fire risk assessments, the encouragement has been that they should get some kind of accreditation scheme to evidence competency, and it's just sort of reassurance to know that we're not pushing them into a cul-de-sac where they're investing time and efforts into something that may be redundant. So no, it's a reassurance.
Well, Alistair, that was the key to it, because when everybody kind of wants to try and favour their own scheme, and that's why the national occupational standards are exactly what they say. That's a national requirement. So if you can demonstrate that you meet that through whatever other scheme, there might be little bits that are slightly better. There might be bits that aren't covered, and you have to do something else with it. But it's a standard benchmark, which is a relatively high enough level that it will mean we're getting where we need to be, and you're not getting like these sort of like grandparents' rights where people come in on something and it isn't quite what you think. Because I mean that's certainly what's happened on some of the medical gas standards, and and it's turned out that we're 15 years down the line and people have forgotten a lot of the basic competencies. So that's why we've sort of taken that, so that we can sort of keep that. It's the level to attain. There's more than one route to attain it, but that's still the level you've got to attain.
Very good, thank you. I'll be quiet again.
No, that's right. I don't. Have we got something in the chat? My apologies for the technical problems with this, but it's if no residue exists in hospital, still a high risk building. I think that's one for you, Maz, because I know you were talking to the solicitors about that again.
Yes. Right. Yes, it does come in if it meets the height criteria. It comes in as a high risk buildings for gateways 2 and 3. It would only come in for the other for Gateway 1 if it had the 2 residences in there as well.
So Ludwig, the answer to that is that all your ones at Charing Cross will all be included, unfortunately, in your tower block and everything that's attached to it. So that's not. Oh no, that's not very helpful.
Yeah, Charing Cross, you've got your own tower block for staff, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to remember being involved with that about 20 years ago.
Did you see the questions? There's a Q&A and a chat. Have you seen the Q&A ones?
No.
Yeah, I've only seen one from Q&A. Is there more?
There's a few more in now. Yeah.
Oh, good. Let me try and how do I refresh that? Or can you read them out, Alessandra? Because I'm
So there's one. Just remind me if I've. It was mentioned that HTM is due to be updated in 23-24. Any guidance on time frame? Has that been answered?
I think so. Yeah. Parts 0503, parts A, B, and K will be updated 24 before summer. The 0501 and 0502 we're looking at doing starting next year, so in 24. So I suspect they will be finished by about 25.
Right. I think there's if a new facility has either water, mist, or sprinklers installed, does this lead to mitigation any of the other measures which would be required?
Yeah, there is that. There is, yes, mitigation. That's already in 0502, and there are some mitigations in there. For instance, hazard rooms, rather than going through the list and seeing if that applies, you can decide on a case-by-case basis whether a hazard room requires to be fire rated or not. So that's in a new facility, yes.
Steve Clifford has asked, does the guidance covered apply to the devolved nations as well as
I did that one at the start.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
What about if a new facility has either water, mist, or sprinklers?
Yeah, just done that one, mate.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
So I think is there anything else? I think we actually run a bit over time due to my poor stewardship and management and talking too much. So is there anything from anybody else?
Not that I can see.
Okay, right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for their interest today, and I hope you found it useful. Again, thanks to Maz for presenting, and thanks to Alessandra to doing what she also always does and sort out all the things that we don't quite get right. Much appreciated, Alessandra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time, ladies and gentlemen, and hope to see you all soon. Cheers, then.
Thank you all.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.